Before we kind of get into all of the deeper issues that we want to talk about today, maybe we can set the scene a little bit. So we're talking about cybersecurity, and maybe we understand that, or there's some of us understand cybersecurity is a little bit more than just having a strong password, right? So maybe you want to tell us a little bit more about what cybersecurity is.
Sure. Well, you know what? That's actually interesting. You mentioned strong passwords. If there's one thing you want people to have is strong passwords, complex, numerical, multiple different types of digits, passwords. So you're actually getting at something very important with cybersecurity, that cybersecurity, if there's something that people should learn about, is it's not an IT domain. Even though it sounds almost ironic and counterintuitive, the idea of cybersecurity is if we're connected, like we are connected online, so some type of digital communication, we all should be thinking about cybersecurity. So I think the best way to put cybersecurity is safety. It's really, when it comes down to it, is safety. No different from physical safety. You wouldn't leave your front door open. You wouldn't leave your back door open. So the same way as cybersecurity is, you think of cybersecurity as safety, online safety, digital connectivity.
Thank you so much. So if we stick to the house analogy, right? If we stick to the house analogy when it comes to cybersecurity, if we were to move into a new house, right? Usually we would do that after having the safety check, right? Making sure that everything is okay. You know, we kind of get that stamp. All right, the house is ready for you to move in. However, with COVID-19, we've seen that many people have begun working from home before we kind of got that safety check, right? So we've seen that, you know, many employees have kind of really from one day to the next, we're told, you know, and all over the world, particularly, you know, obviously in the States, but Japan, really all over. And they've really been told from one day to the next, okay, take your laptop or go home and start working. And we've seen that this has brought incredible opportunity for people, right? But again, there's obviously challenges and maybe risks that are associated with that. So maybe you wanted to share with us a little bit about that analogy of, you know, we've just moved into a house that we really don't have that, we haven't had the security check yet.
Yeah, I'll start with an analogy, because what we do is all about helping communicate to as large number of people as possible the importance of safety. The house analogy is a really fantastic one, but there's also another analogy that I think almost everyone can resonate with, is the car analogy. Safety with driving. So never would you hand over the keys to a person who just recently learned how to drive a car without proper education, without proper licensing, without proper etiquette being placed in the provisioning of that person receiving the keys to then drive a vehicle. So when you look at it in terms of a context of a remote working environment, is that due to COVID-19 and even beyond COVID-19, the workplace environment has been propelled in a faster, outpaced the preparation of the employees and the safety guidelines to ensure that that proper transition to online safety or in a work environment has been done with the right education in place. So what I like to call that is security by design. Most of the time, security is a concept that's bolted on afterwards. So you're deploying your shipping software, you're deploying an entire situation that otherwise is rushing to market without having the proper security features built into the actual deployment of that technology, that software, the service, whether it's education around driver education. So the concept really is about ensuring that the design elements of any type of deployment is built into the fabric of the development.
I think that's such a great point, right? That's it. You know, the idea is, okay, once we've kind of built the thing, okay, let's come in and make sure it's secure. Whereas really, if we've had that idea of, as you mentioned, security by design, maybe the product or the service or whatever it is would even look very different, you know, at the end of the day. What are some of those things that, if we think about, you know, security by design, what are some of the characteristics that you'd recommend for people that you've seen as best practice?
Yeah, so security by design it's going to tell people we have to think about security as a conversation within the early stage narrative about what it is that we're doing. So it's not rushing to market quickly. It's about thinking constructively about what audiences here are we trying to address. And security by design concept is really about telling all the constituents involved in that creative process that it's important that the concept of security And that it's a very broad topic because it depends. Security by design really looks differently if we're talking about something that's, let's say, for example, a social networking device that connects people over some type of a chat communication platform. Well, security by design in that environment is going to think about what are the implications for online safety for children? What are the implications of having protected communities where abuse can take place? And how are we as developers and constituents within that enterprise thinking about not when it happens, but rather in a preventative fashion of we know it's going to happen. This brings up this concept of resilience in cybersecurity is we know that the problems of security risks and vulnerability and the exploits are going to be taken advantage of. So it's a matter of not when it happens, we know it will happen. How are we going to weave that conversation into the development of that product or service? So it really depends on what it is that we're talking about. So we're talking about with that similar analogy of chat communications is you want to go into it thinking about, do you want to have a protected, encrypted environment that allows for that? But then you start thinking about, well, what kind of environment is that going to protect? Well, it might protect the communications of channel 1 to channel B communications, but it may also allow for illicit activity to use that portal to then use it for things that are nefarious. And so that encrypted environment actually ends up facilitating possibly another type of activity that, in other words, you're trying to do one thing, but then now you created a separate category of problems. So when you're doing it by design thinking analogy is you have to really slow down that process and say, how are we going to really understand the affected communities here? And it's going to actually slow it down because a lot of the rush in software development and even any type of innovative thinking is let's get to market quickly and fast and deploy. Instead, we're saying let's slow down and let's think through constructively and talk to our audience and really get a sense of who's going to be affected by this and how are we going to integrate that conversation into the deployment of that activity. And so, and then you have analogies here in so many different, a lot of different industries as well.
Yeah. If we look at, cybersecurity on more of a global lens, who's doing cybersecurity well, and where does Japan fit in their kind of cohort?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of countries doing it well. There's a lot of different surveys and surveys put Japan generally towards the middle to end of in respect to developing countries. Now, countries that are doing it well, you have Israel, Estonia, Singapore, and it really depends. Again, this is a broad, when I say well, it doesn't mean that they're prepared. I think you have to understand cybersecurity is a dynamic environment. Exploits are constantly changing. With the rollout of 5G, you're going to have a lot more computation power on the side of the bad actors to be able to penetrate the whole list of types of categories of industries that otherwise were probably not as easily feasible, but now will be because of the advent of more faster, quicker broadband access. So countries like Japan, since we're talking about Japan, is given the investments and the advancements in technology, it seems almost ironic that the Japan situation falls towards the middle to end of preparedness. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And I don't think it has to do with their lack of ingenuity, but rather there's a possibly a sense of the physical security mindset to address an otherwise omnipresent non-physical environment of the cybersecurity threat. Cybersecurity is not a physical in the front door intrusion. It's often undetected and unseen. And when you think about Japan as a very safe country, the concept of cybersecurity from a strategic perspective as a detection that can't be detected is hard to really fathom for most Japanese people. And then there are lots of investments in places where cybersecurity is doing very well in Japan, but I think on balance, when you compare other really advanced economies, it's woefully underprepared. And there's been a lot of people who've studied this, looked at this closely and said there's a reason for that, both historically, and there's also other kinds of things that may happen within the way in which industries operate in Japan. And maybe also the lack of willingness on the part of the Japanese government as a whole to place that emphasis in cybersecurity resilience.
Right. Tell us a little bit more about cybersecurity resilience. I think, obviously, I think that there's perhaps a hardware characteristic to it, but I can't help but think that we're not simply talking about the infrastructure behind cybersecurity, but maybe there's something else.
Yeah, so resilience is about recognizing cybersecurity is not just a technical feature and that we don't just apply to a technical response. So we have to look at it from a very human-centric understanding of what is cybersecurity risk. When we look at social engineering, phishing, and a lot of the things that are understood to be part of cybersecurity risk is that the entirety of cybersecurity really is about how we understand the human element within these conversations. Now, there's a technical implementation that secures the entire network and the organization from a technical standpoint, but there's people behind all these implementations, and there's people behind each one of these activities. And when you have a resiliency built model, your understanding of this is saying cybersecurity threats will continue to evolve, and they will be likely faster than the way an organization can respond to. And so a resiliency is about knowing that we're here for a long journey, and it's not just we can attack cybersecurity at its core and say we've now resolved the cybersecurity problem and now we can move on to the next task. It's about knowing that the risk actors all around us, from a management risk perspective, from a human-centric understanding, is that the resilience mindset is about emphasizing the human in the core of this, and how are we empowering the individuals within an organization across the entire organization, from executives all the way down to everyday employees who may not think of cybersecurity as something that they should think about, but they should be empowered and given the ability to understand that these issues affect them and every person in the organization. So resilience really comes down to the understanding that there's no one single silver bullet that's going to address cybersecurity, that it's an ongoing, continuous conversation that you have to have. And putting money into it is not really just the answer either. It's really understanding it from a policy standpoint, from a legislative, regulative standpoint. There's so many different aspects to it. So
you touched on a topic that I'm forever interested in, and in how it's applied in different industries, which is that human centricity model that you talked about. It's about building that, finding the human in the process. So I'd love to hear more about your opinion on the human-centric side of cybersecurity, and also when you mentioned, and you also mentioned this at the beginning of our conversation, that we kind of want everyone involved. It's not purely an IT function. That maybe we can look at cybersecurity in terms of our organizational structures with a little bit more with a broader lens. So it's not just that it's an IT department, rather that other people can be involved as well.
Yeah, that's the human element is very important to know. So let's start with something interesting that the Japanese Ministry of Communication reported a few years ago in 2016. They had reported that Japan had experienced 128 billion cybersecurity incidents. So let's pause there.
With a B.
126. 20, it's either 26 or 28, but I think it was 28. But nonetheless, it doesn't really matter, because when you're
it's a lot
with that large number, what you're addressing here is that cybersecurity and the risk is not just a single individual just sitting there trying to penetrate a network. You have that indeed, an individual doing that in the hood, but those are stereotypes. There's lots of different types of actors. There's state-sponsored actors that are organized just like companies and organizations you have in the Western countries, who are sitting there looking to penetrate specific industry. They're known as APTs, Advanced Persistent Threat Actors. And there's APTs that a lot of security researchers study that are coming from all over the world. Some of them are state-sponsored, others are individual groups of people that target industries. And then some of them target specific countries and industries, so critical infrastructure. And so when you look at the totality of this, and when you think about 128 billion cybersecurity incidents that occurred in Japan, on the other side of that, let's say that's so much, but the vast majority of it have been thwarted. So that's a good thing, successfully have been thwarted. But it only takes one single penetration for an organization to have a major breach, for trade secrets to then be exfiltrated and information sent to a competitor or to an adversary country. And so the centricity of the human element here is, well, how do they penetrate that specific network? Well, typically, it's going to be through some kind of a phishing exam type of orientation. So that means that they're attacking some individual through some type of social engineering, building trust and relationship with that individual, using emotionally charged language in COVID, or it might be emotionally charged language related to some type of benefit scam. Like
Right.
Japan had the COVID-19 Kifkin, I think it was called, the benefits that they given out a lot of Japanese over the course of 3-4 months. So when we the centricity of the human is, how are we addressing the core human vulnerability and getting to that issue initially at the same time that you're addressing it from a technical standpoint. So it gets quite complicated because it's not that the challenge with cybersecurity and safety is you have to approach it, I think, in the broad sense from a technical standpoint, but that technical has to be accompanied by a human educational component.
Yeah.
And if you don't
Yeah.
have both, you're going to end up negating each other's strength. In other words, you may have $1 million being built around a very strong network perimeter defense system, but if you have one individual that don't have the right type of training and makes a mistake because of just a human frailty, it's just a normal thing. Everyone makes mistakes. But those mistakes, if they're coming at you with hundreds of millions of those every day, then the chances are you're going to end up penetrating that based on just the nature of errors being likely to occur. So we always want to go back to that core of how are we addressing the human educational component, how are we continuing to address that rather than telling them, we're going to teach you cybersecurity best practices and then revisit this 6 months later. It doesn't really work that way. It really requires a person to shift behavior and address them with the right type of communication and being able to do that in a respectful way.
Well, let's talk about education for a moment, because I think that's really such a driver, especially in Japan. Work from home, we've seen many countries kind of pick that up much earlier than Japan has. And, we've even seen, for example, even during, COVID, that the Marunouchi line and the Yamanote-sen are still full because, people are still told that they have to go to the office. But if we think about that kind of, context, that during this COVID time, we've seen people, okay, I have to do a video call, but their computers, for example, aren't equipped with a webcam, so they run to big camera, buy 100 yen or 500 yen, whatever it is, like web camera, and then stick it into their computer. And so we see that because there's no infrastructure behind, let's call it, technical flexibility or this kind of resilience, we kind of recognize that it's then left to the individual how they then decide on how to do things. And we've seen that with hardware cases, particularly in Japan, that people are just trying to compare or to find compatibility with any kind of hardware for their laptops, rather than their companies doing some research and giving them some really good secure options. And then we've also seen, for example, that maybe their computers or their particular operating systems don't run Zoom, for example. So we've seen people who actually call in from their mobile phone on Zoom and then share their desktop, and then you start seeing these kind of like super complex systems where you think we're mixing private technology and corporate technologies, and then obviously there's that added layer of security complex. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that as well, that the infrastructure just isn't there in order for people to make good decisions.
Yeah, the COVID-19 propelled everyone into a digital transformation reality faster than a lot of companies wanted to. And that presents massive challenges. Now, some organizations were prepared, many of them were not. And even when you're prepared, you have an interesting dichotomy here. At the same time, I'm saying the human element is very important. There's another competing aspect of this where the human element is, I wouldn't say it's not important, but you want to remove the decision-making from the human. In other words, you made an example of the person running to big camera and getting a webcam and doing and fiddling with their devices. Well, you want a system where you remove the individuals to have to do anything like that, where they themselves become their own IT troubleshooting and trying to configure something. Because when you do that, you end up leaving massive gaps within, not only in your own configuration, but also in the lack of security by design in most of these products that are being deployed. I would imagine most of these products that they're buying at the marketplace don't have these built-in security features that you would want them. And Zoom, for example, is one of them. It wasn't until the many instances of Zoom bombing and instances where there were takeovers by individuals who were looking to take advantage of gaps within Zoom's lack of cybersecurity, then it's not until it's much later. And so same with the case with this individual is you want to remove their ability to have to do things so then you can allow them to be able to optimize in the performance of their productivity, which is, and say if they're a communications person, they don't need to become cybersecurity configuration specialists. They should be able to know by default the design elements of what it is that they're using have the features built into that. And so, and that human centricity component is interesting because you don't have that type of design security thinking built in, then the chances of security becoming a problem heightens because of the lack of those controls built into that device that they're using. And so you have, doubly more problems. You have the lack of education on the individual, and then you have also the lack of security by design that's not built into devices that they're using. And then that's just with almost every device. I think it's unfair to really focus on Zoom. It's just because the company has increased its user base by, who knows, 20, 30x in the last 6-7 months, that they have been unfairly targeted. But I would say if you took any device in the marketplace and expanded its user adoption by that magnitude, you probably have massive amounts of security lapses across so many different devices that are commonly used in everyday homes and of course in everyday communication channels in an organization.
Yeah, absolutely. If we think about, access and opportunity. So, we mentioned it's kind of unfair to expect, accountability without education, if people are responsible for hacks when they haven't been educated, for example. But if we think about access, that everyone has to kind of understand what role cybersecurity plays in their, in their organization, or for example, even in their job. If we think about that, and we also think about organizations that are now, propelled, as you mentioned, to adopt digital transformation maybe much earlier than they had expected. What are some of those core steps that you'd recommend them take when that they're redesigning or even designing for the first time their cybersecurity principles?
Yeah, I always like analogies, and I'm in Los Angeles, so I'll use a Hollywood example. Is there's something called the writer's room, where in your composition of a storytelling of a particular show, is you want to have in that writer's room diverse voices. And this is where it's important, where diversity in women and different backgrounds are so critical in telling this story. And we're talking about the writer's room for a Hollywood story, but that is akin to any type of corporate, nonprofit, government organization, because you need to have in that initial early stage conversation truly diverse representation. And so I would say is you really, and I stress, really need to have a diverse voice in that original conversation that's being had about digital transformation. That you shouldn't look at digital transformation as simply an IT and a security thing. You should really look at it and say, how is this affecting the organization as a whole? And how are we managing the risks? And how are we as a resilient organization addressing to overcome those issues? And how are we then building that into the fabric of the culture of that organization? So it really requires that type of thinking, that type of, I don't know if there's the right word, design thinking, because you're the expert in design thinking, but to truly design that into that conversation. And so I really like the writer's room example, because the writer's room, if you don't have the right people in that conversation, how is that story going to truly reflect the experience of a XYZ type person or anything? It doesn't really matter if it's a lived experience, but you really want to have that conversation weaved into that initial thinking for that organization. And I would start there. I like to always take a step back and say, what are we doing as an organization? How are we investing in knowledge transfer? And how are we then taking the representation of our experts in the marketing department, the communications department, HR, IT, and all the different constituent groups, and of course also the company's audience that they're serving. It's also important that we say, who are we serving and how can we make our products and services better received by our clients, our customers, and our communities that we're servicing. And I think if you start doing it that way, you have at least a sense of the importance of cybersecurity. And I don't see a lot of organizations doing it that way. It's usually a rush to do digital transformation. And that's a buzzword in the industries. We're pushing DX and DT and however people call it. It's defined so differently depending on who's saying it. But I like to say, well, it's about education and culture. How are we doing the transformation? Because any transformation is going to be disruption. And when there's disruption, there's going to be sometimes unhappy people in the process going to say, we have these legacy systems. Why are we doing something different? Nothing has been done before that needs to do, so there's a lot of things that can happen. And in that digital transformation, there's going to be also disruption. And so we have to think about, as people designing this conversation, is how are we addressing all these different needs? And so security, I think, at its core, needs to be really embedded with education from the beginning. And if you don't have that, you're going to have more vulnerabilities, you're going to have disappointment across different constituents. And I think the organization as a whole will probably not see an optimal result of digital transformation. I think I've seen a lot of results of successful digital transformation, and the numbers are very small. I mean, most people say 10% of digital transformation projects are successful, which means $1 trillion of different investments in cybersecurity, not necessarily cybersecurity, but digital transformation efforts have gone and have failed in at least their estimation of looking at it and doing a postmortem. So it's a challenging thing for sure. And this is a new era for a lot of people, and a lot of organizations, especially ones that are maybe not as digital, are going to have a harder time. But actually, in some cases, companies that are not as digital, if you want to call it that, it might be a good learning opportunity to not have to deal with any legacies that are then there. So it's possibly could be an innovative time period for them.
Right. We see that actually many Japanese companies are at a point where they can leapfrog, because we really still see what I mean by leapfrog is that we've seen that, that they never kind of really reached the level that we saw in the States or that we saw in Europe of that, medium level digital transformation. They never did that. So there really is this opportunity that they can just kind of skip that, kind of basic CRMs and, things like that. Many people just don't have it, and they can almost just jump that entire kind of phase, and that they can really, access or then just rebuild their initial digital transformation on really what those future technologies are. What would you say to those companies?
I say this is an opportunity to shine and to expand. Take that as no different from a startup who's thinking to start from zero and can leapfrog and can advance so rapidly by using already the knowledge that's been accumulated over the years. Because there's a lot of great thinking that's out there by researchers and people who follow this closely. It's harder when you have deep embedded culture within an organization. You have that, I'm sure, in the Japanese government. Even the way cybersecurity is conceived, it's siloed, and that creates challenges within organizations where they're not able to see the full optimal potential because people are entrenched in their older ways, which again, it makes sense why that happens, but it also thwarts real innovation and creativity to flourish in that environment. And Japan has a lot of lack of that. I mean, there's creative people there, but there's also a lot of lack of independence of thought coming from the major organizations that have done things a certain way, that have organized around certain types of principles. And it's hard to penetrate that from a person from the outside trying to break into that.
That's true. And if we think about that on that topic, your mission is to bring cybersecurity, or to educate every single person in the world, or in Japan. And so if you want to talk to us a little bit about where that motivation came from, that you said, we want to focus on Japan, we want to make Japan our market, and we want to make sure that every single person in Japan knows or has been educated on cybersecurity, because we need motivation when it comes to challenges, right? Because otherwise you kind of see this mountain and you think, oh gosh, that's just kind of too overwhelming. So tell us a little bit about what that motivation was that kind of that made you focus and said, this is the market that we're going to serve.
Yeah. So I'm an entrepreneur. I've started a couple of companies in Japan and outside of Japan as well. So some of them have been successful, others have not been successful in different industries. Some of them in technology, others in legal, and this one in cybersecurity education. So the way I look at this is I always want to look at large market opportunities. So there's a couple of things here that aligns neatly. You have a great social purpose in the form of education for 126 million people. It's the population of Japan. And I'll get to why I say 126 million. And then there's the side of a business opportunity. We know that the Japanese market from cybersecurity is the largest market outside of the United States, excluding China. So if you look at this, the market opportunity from a cybersecurity investment perspective is massive in Japan. So there's that conversation to be had. Now I'm taking both of these, the alignment of the investment in cybersecurity education with a social purpose and mission. So Saya represents my daughter, actually, who was born recently. And so when I was in Japan a few years ago, I would host these cybersecurity summits that we had put together over the course of the last 3 years that culminated into my understanding of what was needed in Japan, that there was a lot of effort focusing on technology and digital transformation and all the different tools to help that transformation journey. But there was very few, if any, conversation around educating the people that are going to be impacted by this digital transformation. And so when I looked at this, I would host these cybersecurity summits in Japan where we would have all these different people across Asia attend. And I learned over time that very few people were thinking about how are we providing educational tools for everyday people to ensure that in this digital transformation that they are safe and protected. And at that time, my daughter was born. She's 3 years old now. This is 3 years ago when we put together our first event in Tokyo. And I was thinking about that in the context of children, because children are moving into this world of total connectivity. We have 20 billion devices that are connected now in the world. And when you think about the vast number of connectivity, a lot of people like to say is when you're connected, you're now exploitable. In other words, you become a vulnerable hotspot, if you will, for cyber criminals to be able to attack, whether it's your cameras that are monitoring your children when they're sleeping, to computer devices, network safety, and at the home office. There's all these different vulnerabilities that presents itself. And so Saya really is about how are we investing in ensuring that as we allow people to connect online, are we then also investing in security education ongoing as that journey expands and more devices enter the market? So rather than saying, let's try to halt this transformation, which you can be more of a Luddite and say, I want people to be disconnected, which doesn't seem to be a practical solution. Is people are going to be connected, our children are going to be connected, they're going to learn and educate through these connected devices. So if that's the reality, what are we doing as a society? That's more of a philosophical question. How are we ensuring that the governments, the local ward offices, the states, counties are empowering their citizenry to be able to receive education in their language? And that's critical too. It's not being able to just take existing American-centric content or British-centric content. There's a lot of security awareness content out there put together by very good security awareness companies. But one of the things that they lack is insight and understanding into a Japanese situation. So, and those are very uniquely different. That my number exists just in Japan. It doesn't exist in America. So we're not going to likely see security conversations around the threats and the vulnerabilities in the my number management system and how that affects Japanese everyday people. So that's where we came with this idea of how are we addressing 126 million people, because the presumption here is that everyone's going to get connected and every single person is exposed and possibly could be a victim to this. So.
You mentioned that maybe the copy and paste model isn't necessarily one that's going to get us to those 126 million people being educated. Can you talk to us a little bit more about maybe the context that you found unique that we need to keep in mind when approaching cybersecurity in a Japanese context?
Yeah, so the cybersecurity context in Japan, there's going to be, let's say this, I'm just going to give an arbitrary number, let's say 50% of the available educational resources that are in the marketplace can be applied to Japanese learners. And you can localize it, translate it, and make it available. But there's
Right.
also a 50, 30, depending on how you look at it, the type of industry, there's going to be a significant amount of lack of stories that are going to resonate with an
Mhm.
everyday Japanese corporate learner or a
Right.
family. And so
Right.
we looked at that and said, what are those stories and how can we
Mhm.
expedite learning and we can continue to innovate on that and
Mhm.
provide the most relevant stories in the fastest way possible that is
Right.
resonating and can shift behavior and heighten a person's consciousness. And so
Mhm.
that's the way that we approached the Japanese situation. And we're
Mhm.
looking to replicate that across different countries. So we're looking at
Mhm.
India. In India, it's interesting because you have over 20 different languages,
Right.
different
Yeah.
states have different ways
Mhm.
to really communicate effectively. And you can use, of
Access to
course, English.
technologies. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the places India is at least people talk about it, is it's the fastest growing internet connected country in the world, where you
Mhm.
have the vast number of the population who is still not connected but coming online for the first time. And
Yeah.
that's a very vulnerable population when you have people going online for the first time. And
Right.
that's a vulnerable population that you need to educate to ensure that if you're going to equip them with access to internet
Mhm.
technologies, then you also want to make sure that you have proper cyber hygiene
Right.
provided. So, and that's sort of how we approached it, country by country. But right
Mhm.
now, our focus has been Japan. That's been
Mhm.
something I've been interested in for a while in Japan in general.
Mhm. If we
Mhm.
think about cybersecurity, obviously in terms of there's that business lens, but if we think about it, it's not purely for businesses. You also mentioned households. So if we think
Yeah.
about even concepts like the digital twin, for example, can you talk to us a little bit about maybe even how to introduce to a Japanese household that cybersecurity is actually a relevant dinner table conversation?
That's a the family episodes are challenging because you have to
Mm,
think about who the audience is at different age categories. And
mm,
so we're constantly working on script tell. We have a script and storytelling group within our company that specializes in just looking at how to learn about security, but in a
mm,
non-security way. And
mhm.
it's one of the challenging things, I think, with IT and cybersecurity, because cybersecurity is typically known to be a function within IT, which it's not really, but let's just assume it's more of a technical field. And so people think of it as a very technical type of vocation,
Mhm,
which in a lot of ways it is. However, they may not be the best persons or people to tell the
mhm,
story of how to stay safe. And so what we're trying to do is take the complexity of cybersecurity and make that relevant to everyday families, children at various different age categories, and
mhm,
find different cues that allow for that story to be impactful. And
mhm,
that takes a lot of talking and listening. A lot of what we have to do is listen and
mm,
to talk and get a sense of what it is that they think of when they think of cybersecurity, and
mhm.
then craft stories around that. And so,
Maybe even using even stories within the media. So, for example, one thing
mm,
that we saw recently was that one of the members of Terrace House, which is a Japanese, semi-reality TV show,
yeah,
committed suicide due to,
right.
cyberbullying. So, of course, we see cybersecurity in terms of, businesses and, managing threats and, not losing money and things like that. But if we're thinking, and you mentioned that Sai University is driven or was founded in the motivation of your daughter, that we're actually looking to provide cybersecurity for younger people and for children,
Mm,
not so they sit out so that they see how scary it is. It's actually so that they get educated, so they when they play the game, when they get in, they use internet, and they get involved, that they're actually that they're more poised for safety, that they participate in a way that's safe for them. And if we think about, for example, the terrace house example with Hannah, who committed suicide, if we think about that, then we can kind of see that this idea that there's an internet world and then there's a physical world, those boundaries kind of start getting blurred, don't they?
yeah, they do. And that's a great point that you bring up, is you take stories that are inspired by real life events. And that's important too, is you want to be looking at stories that people can relate to. And that
Mm-hmm.
one, the Hana-san commitment is an interesting one because it really affected a lot of people and brought the national spotlight to the concept of online bullying and how that's a real thing that can affect a person in such a significant way. So our storytelling is constantly looking at the Japanese press, seeing how can we have stories that reflect the milieu of the Japanese person. And so, and that's because I keep saying it's a hard thing. It's not easy to do, and it's not just a technical repetition of saying don't click on these links and don't do this. And I think that often sounds more pedantic. And when you're doing that, you can also separate yourself from the audience that you're trying to impact positively by just being more of a lecture oriented, top down, don't do this, don't click on these links, but rather saying this is something that collectively as a society we should have a responsibility, and as a parent we should invest in education. So in some ways our stories are being told to the parents, and the parents' responsibility to then be able to communicate the right type of approach with their children and having that conversation. So that's sort of how I'm looking at the storytelling when it comes to younger people. Is most of the time younger people are going to be under the auspices of their parents up until a certain age. And so our stories are meant to appeal to parents with children, and so that we can in turn allow them to be able to take seriously the importance of ensuring that they communicate that with their sibling, their children.
Right. And if we, and it's one of those things, it's the idea that these attacks are not necessarily from, as you mentioned, those people in a hoodie, in a dark room, kind of like hacking away. That's not really what it's about. Often it comes from, and I guess we can't talk about cybersecurity long without bringing up trust, but it often comes from trusted sites, or it comes from, familiar environments, but, that maybe that there's been, there's been a change in the environment, for example. So if we were to think about the relationship that trust plays in an organization, I'd be really interested to hear that, and especially from the system. If we think about that Japanese companies are often very complex stakeholder relationships. So, for example, you might have company A might be serving the customer, but really they might then have like a sub company that then actually manages the data. And so, really, that there's a lot of data sharing that goes on amongst Japanese organizations. So maybe we can also talk about trust not only with the user directly, with that human, but maybe even the trust within the ecosystems in which we're using this data.
Yeah, that's there's a lot of layers
Sorry.
to that. There's also a concept in cybersecurity called zero trust. Trust but verify concept, and it's a whole other conversation. We won't get into that, but it actually essentially says you can't trust anything and you shouldn't trust. And it's a little different from just the human aspect of trust behaviors and building a relationship between people, but there is that element to that. Nonetheless, going on to the human aspect of trust, yeah, that trust is hard because vulnerabilities arise when people are trusting. And a lot of penetration from social engineering is built on the abundance of trust that often maybe Japanese may find themselves finding to have more of than others who are maybe more skeptical and suspect. And so that's a challenge, because you don't want them to say that you should be distrustful of people, but rather understand how trust can be manipulated and socially engineered to achieve an outcome so that person can then be better protected. So trust is a challenge in a lot of different ways. And you have that aspect of just the human element, trust, but you also have legal rules that over the last couple of years have been strengthened to ensure that organizations take importance people's data. And you have passages of the Act on Personal Protection of Information, the APPI in Japan, that up until recently didn't really strengthen or enforce the need to ensure that companies properly build safeguards and also have penalties if they don't. And so the challenge here is there's a big difference between organizations in the United States and organizations in Japan. It's not necessarily that these organizations are different in that they don't care about the people's data. It's just that there's a certain culture of civil consequences in certain jurisdictions due to the country's response on the legislative and policy side. And so that has an impact on how companies then respond to the need to have to build an environment where they safeguard and hold their own customers' data as valuable and put the right safeguards and invest into that. Now, you may find another country may not have that. In Japan, you don't have much of that environment where you have a civil litigation culture, where if you were to breach that trust and use that data for things that otherwise violate that individual customer's personal information, there are certain consequences in Europe with the GDPR, in California with the CCPA, and there's so many different rules that are changing over, not just in the United States and Europe, but all around the world. Korea has their own personal protection act that also places huge focus on the individual as needing to be protected, and organizations must adhere to that or certain consequences are going to be levied. And the consequences typically tend to be financial impacts. And so in Japan, we're seeing that slowly that's being developed. And so more emphasis is placed on building that framework so that you have a legal framework and understanding. And whether the person feels like there's a trust environment, that almost becomes kind of a secondary issue. It's right. Is there proper regimes in place, and is it governing that company's relationship with that customer's data?
I think that's a great point, that there is a very very close connection between Japanese business and Japanese government. So I do wonder what kind of maybe even policy, and we don't have to get into the details of policy. I'm certainly not someone to write policy, but if we were to kind of think about what are some of those overarching themes, what are some of those overarching topics that might support or assist Japan in propelling their cybersecurity maturity?
Yeah, there's a lot. There's one basic law in the Japanese government, the basic law on cybersecurity. I think it was passed five years ago, and then they have the APPI. But you have a patchwork. You don't really have a lot of emphasis and focus where companies are at least pressured by force of fear of penalties. I think the upper limit up until just a few months ago in Japan for data breach violation was I think, I'm trying to remember the number, but it was an insignificant number. It just got moved to just about $1 million US, or I think it was, I'm not sure how much yen that is, 10 million yen or something like that. But nonetheless, there's very little. Yeah. So the need to have a framework to ensure that organizations have to take seriously a individual's data and ensure that cybersecurity is met needs to happen from a couple of different places. One, you have to have the willingness on the side of governments to ensure that the right investments are going into this, the right type of knowledge transfer is placed into maturing this industry. And when you compare that to other countries, there's a lot of lack of that type of maturation happening in Japan. And so consider now this is in relationship to the vast size of the country. So it's still the third largest economy in the world, and you don't have that kind of significant investments placed on the need to have to make sure cybersecurity is a central core strategic advantage, and also to be thought of as a management risk initiative that everyone in the C-suite needs to take importantly and critically. And so to have that, you have to have so much
coordination. Yeah, I think
it's a coordination, but it's a patchwork of so many different organizations. You need to, because there's also a lot of military overlay in cybersecurity. And so let's say if you take, for example, Israel, you have, I think, a very robust cybersecurity industry. And it's a smaller country, of course, but you have such investment placed on the country's. It may be an issue of geography in place, and given its historical experience vis-a-vis
Right,
its countries around it, its
right.
knowledge and consciousness of the environment that it's living in. So the emphasis placed on security and risk is such a high frequency for
Mm,
everyone who lives in Israel, versus if you were to take Japan,
which is
again,
an
going back to
island.
what we just said, it's
Yeah.
almost the opposite, which is not a bad thing. It just means that as a safe country physically, it
Yeah.
doesn't become an issue for everyday Japanese to
Mm,
think about cybersecurity threats
that's
coming
right.
from North Korea or China or wherever it may be. Russia could be coming from the United States for all that.
Mm,
Who knows? But the point is, we don't have that kind of consciousness of everyday
mm,
thinking about cybersecurity as something every single person would think about. And to have that kind of knowledge transfer and maturation in a country like
yeah.
Japan, I think we're heading in that direction.
Mm,
There's a lot of great groups that are putting together industry-led, like cross-sector forum in
mhm,
Japan that started in 2015 by, I think, it's three leading Japanese companies, Hitachi, NTT, and
mhm.
NEC. Now, these are representative of probably 0.5 or 1% of industry in Japan. Now, there's still the rest of the tens of thousands of enterprises in Japan that are probably completely ignoring cybersecurity.
Mm,
And that's where the threats, I think, remain. In these larger enterprises, your NEC,
right.
NTTs, Fujitsu, Hitachi, I wouldn't say that they're completely immune to security risks, but I would say they're probably akin to a solid cybersecurity, thoughtful and conscious company. But that
Right.
only represents such a small fragment of Japanese society.
Right. I think it's true. If we look at the small to medium enterprises being the larger contribution of the Japanese economy, that's certainly
Yeah.
something to keep in mind. And if we think about the Suga government, for example, the new government that's in now, they've come out and they've said some, very, taken a very strong position on digital transformation. Like I was watching a YouTube video, and with the transformation minister said, or there was a question, and the question was, yeah, but what happens if my manager says that I have to come to the office even in these times of Corona just for a hanko? And he said something along the lines of, well, tell me who they are, and I'm going to talk to them directly. And I thought, oh wow, we've never heard someone kind of come out with that strong of a point.
This is a great initiative. The digital cho and the emphasis placed on digital transformation. Now, my only concern is that I hope that that conversation embeds within that narrative education.
Right.
And I don't know if it is. It might just be about rapidly digitizing the old antiquated systems of hanko or fax machines. That's, I think, just a small aspect of digital transformation. So we should
Mm,
really think about with Suga, and he's made some great remarks in the past about the importance of cybersecurity. So I'm very
mm,
hopeful for that. The appointment of a digital minister specifically on digital transformation is also a great step in
absolutely.
making the narrative, at least the case for the importance of digitization. But I'm hoping that with that case that's being made and the transformation that happens, is that the investment in education accompanies that. That's again going back to my
Mm,
initial conversation about handing the keys to your 16-year-old and say, here's a car, just go and drive. That's to me
right.
akin to when someone says, we're just going to remove the fax machine and then give people
Yeah,
access to the
that's
internet.
right.
You can't do that. You need to say, here's access to the internet, here's access to the keys, but there's also two or three other things that you need to do. Is a license, an education, it's a
Yeah.
continuing educational experience that you have to go through to ensure that you're continuing to learn as you have the responsibility of a
Right.
4,000-pound vehicle.
Yeah. Well, talk to us, and I cannot believe that our hour together has almost come to an end. But in closing, why don't you talk to us a little bit about education? And as you mentioned, or we've talked about education, but why don't we wrap up again with education? Because as you mentioned, we have, for example, new drivers, which, for example, are the younger generation coming in. But at the same time, we still, Japan has an aging workforce, which means I think the education is going to need to be different, across the company. So if we kind of wrap up with what some of either the thought leadership, or what are some of the characteristics of a sustainable education model for cybersecurity in Japan?
Yeah. That's a good question. So people forget when we're talking about education, our educational model is delivered around a e-learning and scalability. And so you can't have 126 million people or a million people come and sit and watch a seminar in live fashion. So you have to be able to make sure that your content is easily digestible, it's scalable, and affordable. And so with that, we built our entire library of content with that principle in mind. Like, how are we as a company going to reach the numbers that we want to? And we can't do it ourselves. We have various different partners in Japan, and we have different mechanisms to be able to deliver those modalities. And it's never going to be accomplished by just one organization. I look at that as saying, I hope all companies that are involved with digital transformation look at it as how are we also providing education. And so we're looking to partner with digital transformation companies, specialist technology, education, e-learning companies, which we are slowly, and integrating our content and our learning inside that stream of conversation. And so our education is meant to be developed through the stream of work, which is, in other words, meaning that in the course of an everyday person, that the availability of education comes unintrusively within their environment. So it's not just here, go learn this, check the box, and then you're just going to move on your way and become cybersecurity ready. Instead, is part of learning is knowledge transfer and the continuation of that learning. So all our content is not only is it developed, scripted all originally in Japanese with Japanese voices, Japanese stories, but also how can we then take the best of today's technology, the various different e-learning platforms, and make it available to as many people as possible. And so that's the model in which we're delivering in Japan and also in other countries as well. So, and that's very key for us, is making sure that it's accessible and affordable, because in a lot of cases, you can't expect a family to then buy your security awareness content and have them pay for it. So like, no, I don't think that's the responsibility of the family to do. I think it's the responsibility of an organization, either to look at that as a country, what are we doing to invest to make sure all of our society is empowered? And so working with organizations that are aligned with that mission.
Yeah. Jonathan, on that note, I can't think of a better place. I don't want to say stop the conversation, but I think we're just going to have to pause the conversation, because I think there's so much that we'll see over the next, particularly 9 to 12 months.
Yeah.
And then again, with the Olympics take two, and I think there's so much. So certainly let's stay in contact and come back and update the business karaoke community on what's going on in Japan and what we should be on the lookout for, because people like you and the work that you do is just so important and so fundamental, this next economy and this next world that we're building. So thank you so much for all the work you do.
Oh, thank you for having me, Brittany. Appreciate it.